You know, it's amazing how much information we are bombarded with constantly every single day, right? It's tough to really stay informed. It feels like we're drowning in it a lot of the time. So today, we're going to try to unpack a few things that we think are pretty important.
Yeah, we're going to deep dive into all kinds of stuff today. We've got reports and discussions on the table ranging from the influence of pharmaceutical advertising to a pretty disturbing police interaction. Some interesting things going on in Canada politically, a lot of anxiety brewing in Europe, and even a pretty spectacular Hollywood flop.
We're going to look past the headlines, right? We're going to see if we can figure out what's really going on behind the scenes and how these seemingly random events might actually be connected. So first up, let's talk about big pharma advertising and how it affects what we see and hear in the media.
I think it's really interesting that RFK Jr. is calling for a ban on direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising, especially when you consider that most other developed countries already have such bans in place. This really sets the U.S. and New Zealand apart.
And the money involved is just mind-boggling. The pharmaceutical industry spends something like $4.5 billion every year on advertising. And get this, some years they actually spend more on advertising than they do on research and development. Makes you wonder what their priorities are.
It definitely raises questions about where their focus lies. And when you look at where these ad dollars are going, the picture becomes even clearer. In 2024, almost a third of all advertising time during primetime news broadcasts came from pharmaceutical companies. That's a huge influence right there.
It is. And the idea is that this level of spending creates a media environment that is, well, let's just say less likely to be critical of big pharma. It's not necessarily about explicit agreements or quid pro quo, but more of an unspoken understanding. If a media company gets a big chunk of its revenue from drug companies, they might not be so eager to do any serious investigative reporting that could upset their sponsors.
Yeah, that reminds me of that whole Project Veritas thing from early 2023 where they got that Pfizer executive on camera. You remember that? He basically admitted that their research practices were pretty shady, similar to what was happening in Wuhan, and hinted that there wasn't much real regulatory oversight.
And the fallout from that whole situation was very telling. Pfizer, despite these pretty serious allegations, didn't really suffer any consequences. But Project Veritas, the group that exposed this information, well, they faced a lot of problems. And Tucker Carlson, who was one of the few people in the mainstream media who actually covered the story, was taken off the air not long after that. You can't deny that there's some serious power dynamics at play here.
It seems like the people who exposed this information were the ones who really paid the price, not Pfizer. It just highlights how much influence Big Pharma has over our media and political systems.
And that brings us back to RFK Jr.'s argument for a ban. He says all this advertising has basically compromised the integrity of news reporting and is a big reason why drug prices are so much higher in America than in other developed countries. It's a compelling argument.
Think about Skyrizi, for example. Their advertising budget doubled between 2022 and 2023, and their sales in the U.S. went up by like 50%. There weren't any major changes to the drug itself, just a ton more advertising, and suddenly everyone wants it.
And it's not just advertising. Big Pharma also has other advantages, like how hard it is to sue them for vaccine injuries. It feels like there's a whole system designed to shield them from accountability.
And at the end of the day, it's the consumers who end up footing the bill for all this advertising. The cost of those ads is built right into the price of the drugs. The American Medical Association actually voted to ban direct-to-consumer advertising a while back because they were worried about rising drug prices and people feeling pressured to demand specific medications they saw advertised.
Right. And the way these ads are structured is also a problem. They have to list all the side effects, but it's usually just a super fast list of scary sounding things that probably won't happen to you. It's like they're trying to make us numb to the idea of any real risks.
The interesting thing is how these ads often sell the disease more than the drug itself. They list a bunch of symptoms and make you think, hey, maybe I have that, and then encourage you to ask your doctor for the specific drug by name. They're turning the whole doctor-patient relationship upside down. There's actually research showing that people are more likely to get a prescription for a drug if they've seen it advertised.
It feeds into this idea that pills are the solution for every problem, whether it's anxiety, depression, or even gender identity issues.
Yeah.
And because the mainstream media doesn't really challenge this narrative, it just becomes the accepted truth.
So what would happen if we actually did ban direct-to-consumer drug ads? Well, corporate media would definitely lose a lot of money, and we might see a resurgence of real investigative journalism focused on the medical industry. But of course, any ban would face huge legal battles based on the First Amendment.
It would be a monumental legal battle. Now let's shift gears and talk about a very disturbing situation in Colorado involving a 17-year-old and a former teacher.
This is a really troubling story. We have a minor, a 17-year-old, who is apparently experiencing gender confusion, who was allegedly taken in by a former teacher and their partner without the mother's consent. And what's even worse is that the police reportedly refused to get involved.
And there's body cam footage of the interaction, and it's pretty
Oh, God.
disturbing. The officer talked to the kid for like 2 seconds just to make sure they were okay, then basically brushed off the mother, who was obviously very upset. The officer said something like, "This isn't really a matter for law enforcement, and we're not going to drag her out of there."
The thing that really stood out to me was how the officer put air quotes around the phrase legally a minor, like it was some kind of joke. We're talking about a 17-year-old who is legally still a child, allegedly being kept from her mother against her will.
It's hard not to be outraged by this. The mother was clearly in distress, and the officer just didn't seem to care. I mean, taking a minor without the consent of their parent or guardian is pretty much a textbook example of a situation that requires police intervention. The commentator whose work we're reviewing thinks there's something more going on here and questions the officer's motives for downplaying the situation.
Yeah, this case brings up some serious concerns about the influence of certain ideologies in our public schools, especially when it comes to gender issues. The source material even suggests that the public school system in some states has become a danger to children, and that parents are facing huge obstacles when they try to protect their kids.
That's a bold statement. It shows just how worried some people are about the agendas being pushed in some schools. Okay, let's switch gears again and talk about the political situation up in Canada. They just had a snap election and things are getting interesting.
The Canadian political landscape is always shifting. Right now, the Liberals are trying to win by playing up fears of American colonialism and making Donald Trump the bogeyman.
A Canadian journalist named David Cadden says that the Liberals' whole strategy, whether it's Trudeau or Mark Carney, is to run against Trump. And ironically, Trump might have accidentally helped Carney by making some comments that were perceived as an endorsement.
Mark Carney is described as an unelected globalist, and he's running on a platform that some see as a pretty radical environmental agenda, one that's not exactly in line with the U.S. He has also made some interesting comments in the past about things like wanting the Chinese yuan to replace the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency and supporting digital currencies that are controlled by a global bank.
And here's where things get a little strange. A recent poll showed a big jump in support for the Liberals from 26% in January to 46%, and apparently it's all thanks to Carney. The commentator we're looking at finds that hard to believe because Carney doesn't exactly have a lot of charisma and doesn't seem to connect well with everyday Canadians. There's a story about how he refused to meet with a group of fishermen, which just reinforces that image of him being out of touch.
The theory is that Carney, like Trudeau, is basically being installed by globalist organizations like the World Economic Forum to push their agenda. The source also points out that Canada's economy has been stagnant for the past 10 years thanks to high taxes and too much government regulation.
Carney is promising a 1% tax cut for the middle class, but that's pretty weak compared to Pierre Poilievre, who's proposing a 15% cut. And Carney's stance on things like pipelines and fossil fuels seems to be changing. He used to be all about shutting down pipelines and crippling Alberta's energy industry, but now he's trying to sound more moderate. But he still supports things like net zero policies and carbon taxes on businesses, which some experts think will wreck the economy.
Liz Truss, the former UK Prime Minister, worked with Carney when he was the head of the Bank of England, and she's warning that his policies will cause economic chaos in Canada. She's speaking from experience. And let's not forget that Carney was a UN Goodwill Ambassador for climate change, so it's pretty clear that his main goal is to push that agenda.
Oh, and here's a real bombshell. Apparently, Carney has said that his biggest inspirations are Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. If that's true, it really makes you rethink his whole political philosophy.
It definitely adds a whole new layer of meaning to his policy ideas and his vision for Canada. Let's move on to Europe, where things are getting pretty tense. People are worried, and governments are telling their citizens to prepare for the worst.
Yeah, this is pretty scary stuff. The EU is actually telling people to stockpile food and other essentials because they're worried about Russian aggression. That's a big deal coming from the EU.
To understand what's happening now, we need to go back a bit. The source material talks about how the U.S. has been involved in Ukraine for a long time, since 2014, actually. We're talking about USA, the CIA, and neoconservative figures influencing Ukrainian politics and pushing the country towards the West. The source also mentions the corruption in Ukraine and the whole controversy over biolabs operating there. It's important to keep all that in mind.
The EU is basically saying that Russia could attack within the next 3 to 5 years, so people need to have emergency supplies, and they're setting up a new crisis center. And it's not just the EU. Individual countries like France, Poland, and Germany are also issuing warnings and getting ready for a potential conflict.
We're even seeing reports about possible mass evacuations, people building bunkers, and even talk of bringing back the draft in some European countries. It's starting to feel a lot like the lead up to World War II. Poland is apparently planning to train every man under the age of 65 for military service.
And yet at the same time, there are reports that the U.S. is trying to broker a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine in the Baltic Sea and a deal for energy resources. There's even talk about Washington maybe easing some of the sanctions against Russia.
But the EU is saying they won't lift sanctions until Russia completely withdraws from Ukraine, which everyone knows isn't going to happen anytime soon. And then there are these reports about Ukraine attacking Russian energy infrastructure, even though they supposedly agreed not to. It's a very complicated situation.
Some European figures like Kaja Kallas, who's a member of the Bilderberg Group, are very critical of Trump and Russia, and they seem to be actively working against any peace deals. And Trump himself has made some comments in the past about how much money the U.S. spends on defending Europe and how little appreciation they get in return.
The U.S. Secretary of Defense has even accused some European countries of freeloading when it comes to defense spending. But to be fair, Trump did manage to get some NATO members to increase their contributions when he was in office. He also claims that the U.S. has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on Ukraine under Biden and that the whole war could have been avoided.
And while some smaller European countries are increasing their military budgets, they just don't have the manpower to really make a difference. There are even reports of pamphlets about ballistic missile interceptors being distributed in France. It feels like people are preparing for a nuclear war.
Trump has always been a big advocate for worldwide denuclearization, which
Mhm.
puts him at odds with the military-industrial complex and those who benefit from international conflict. And the source material we're looking at makes a pretty interesting observation. They say that Europe has basically been taken over by liberal and woke ideologies, which has led to suppression of free speech and political dissent. This has created a real divide between Europe and the U.S.
So Europe wants the U.S. to do all the fighting, while the U.S. is starting to wonder if it's even worth it and looking at other options like easing sanctions and maybe letting Russia and Ukraine work things out economically.
It looks like the U.S. and Europe are on very different pages strategically, and the tension is definitely rising. To finish things off, let's talk about a completely different kind of failure. The new Snow White movie, which totally bombed at the box office.
This one's a perfect example of what some people are calling insufferable girl bossing and being completely out of touch with reality.
The movie starring Rachel Zegler got terrible reviews right from the start.
The trailer was the most downvoted movie trailer in YouTube history, and the reviews were awful. A low score on Rotten Tomatoes, a really bad rating on IMDb, and terrible user reviews on Metacritic. But Zegler's response to all this was tone deaf, to say the least. She even bragged about the movie being #1 in the world when it was clearly a flop.
It's like she was living in a fantasy world. She even posted a video of herself laughing in an empty theater like it was some kind of joke.
The internet had a field day with that one. There are tons of memes and jokes about empty theaters with her face on them, and this whole thing fits into a bigger pattern of problems for Disney. They've made some really questionable decisions lately.
And now there's data showing that YouTube is more popular than Netflix and Disney in the US, especially among people over 50. That's a big deal. It shows that people's viewing habits are changing.
There's also a lot of backlash against Anthony Mackie for some comments he made about Captain America. And then there were those accusations that Disney was lightening the skin tones of Black characters in their movies to appease the Chinese market. It seems like Disney is alienating their audience by messing with classic characters and stories that people love.
The source calls them destroyers, not creators, which is pretty harsh, but also kind of accurate.
Yeah.
It feels like Disney is imploding and the internet is just watching it burn.
I've covered a lot of ground today, from Big Pharma's influence on the media to a disturbing police interaction in Colorado, the political drama in Canada, the rising tensions in Europe, and even a Hollywood flop.
And as we've explored these seemingly unrelated events, we've seen some common threads. The abuse of power, the manipulation of public perception, and the consequences when institutions become disconnected from the people they're supposed to serve.
It just shows you how interconnected everything really is and how important it is to be aware of these dynamics as we try to make sense of the world. So here's a final thought for you. If advertising can have such a big impact on how we perceive the pharmaceutical industry, Could similar forces be shaping our understanding of global politics or even the entertainment we consume?
It's a great question. We encourage you to keep thinking critically about the information you encounter and to never stop questioning the narratives you're being presented with.